The town of San Isidro, nestled in the sun-drenched province of Pampanga, often hummed with the gentle rhythm of rural life. But today, it buzzed with a singular electric excitement. The air itself seemed to shimmer with anticipation, carrying the scent of ylang-ylang blossoms and the distant, savory promise of roasting lechon. In the modest yet impeccably kept home of the Santos family, a different kind of energy thrummed, a blend of nervous joy and sacred tradition. Today was Maria Santos's wedding day, and to the entire town, she was the picture of a perfect bride, a living embodiment of a dream nurtured in the hearts of every young girl in their community. Her beauty was not the sharp, dazzling kind. It was a soft, radiant glow that seemed to emanate from a profound and gentle happiness within. She moved with a grace that made the simple act of adjusting a flower in her hair seem like a moment captured from a classic film. Her fiancé, Gabriel Lorenzo, was the son of a successful Manila businessman who had chosen to return to his provincial roots, and he was everything a family could hope for. Kind-eyed, respectful, financially secure, and utterly devoted to Maria. Theirs was a love story the town loved to tell, a modern fairy tale with roots deep in their shared soil. But every fairy tale, it seems, has its shadow, and in this one the shadow was cast by the figures standing closest to the radiant bride. Selena Cortez, Maria's chief bridesmaid and self-proclaimed best friend since they were girls chasing each other through rice paddies, held a smile on her face that was a masterful work of art. To any casual observer, it was a smile of pure, unadulterated joy for her dearest friend. But had anyone cared to look closely, to truly see past the performative delight, they would have noticed the subtle strain at the corners of her mouth, the fleeting, vacant look in her eyes as she watched the whirl of activity around Maria, and the way her fingers would occasionally clench and unclench at her side. The dress she wore, a beautiful shade of seafoam green chosen by Maria herself, felt to Selena not like an honor, but like a uniform of her own irrelevance. She was the backdrop against which Maria's star shone ever brighter. Their history between them was a long tapestry of intertwined lives, but where Maria saw threads of unwavering friendship, Selena now only saw the patterns of her own diminishing returns. They had shared everything: secrets whispered under the blanket of night, dreams confided about futures far away from their small town, tears shed over childhood scrapes and adolescent heartbreaks. Selena had always been the more daring one, the one with the sharper wit and the bigger, seemingly more ambitious dreams. She was the one who was going to conquer Manila, find a powerful husband, and live a life of glamour and importance. Maria, sweet, gentle Maria, was content with the simple life, her dreams tethered to home, family, and a quiet, profound love. The cruel irony was a poison that seeped into Selena's soul daily. It was Maria who had captured the heart of the most eligible bachelor their town had produced in a generation. It was Maria who was stepping into a life of effortless comfort and adoration, a life Selena had fiercely believed was her own destiny. She had loved Gabriel first, from afar, constructing elaborate fantasies around him from the moment his family returned to San Isidro. She had believed her city's sharpened edges and ambitious fire would be what drew him in. But Gabriel's heart had been captured by Maria's quiet strength, her genuine kindness, the way her entire face lit up when she laughed. To him, Selena's ambition felt like calculation. Maria's contentment felt like home. The envy was a quiet parasite at first, feeding on small moments. The way Gabriel's hand would rest on the small of Maria's back, a gesture of unconscious possession and care. The way he listened, truly listened, when she spoke about her plans for a small flower shop, a dream Selena had privately dismissed as quaint and pathetic. The lavishness of the wedding preparations, the heirloom veil that Gabriel's own grandmother had brought out of a velvet-lined chest, a masterpiece of Spanish-era lace and hand-sewn pearls that was said to be centuries old. Each detail was a needle prick in Selina's heart. The envy festered in the dark corners of her mind, twisting and growing until it was no longer a simple jealousy, but a profound and bitter resentment. It felt like a betrayal. Maria had taken the script of Selina's life and with her gentle, unknowing hands had rewritten herself as the heroine. As the wedding day dawned, a terrible, desperate plan began to crystallize from the acid of her bitterness. She remembered the stories, the whispered warnings from her childhood spent with her stern, intimidating grandmother, Alingrosa, a woman who lived on the mist-shrouded slopes of Mount Arayat and was spoken of in hushed tones. The old woman spoke of old ways, of powers that slept in the land, of a different kind of mutia, not a talisman of blessing, but one of corrupted beauty, a vessel for a vengeful spirit that answered the calls of the truly desperate, those whose hearts were blackened by the venom of envy. It was a forbidden knowledge, a dangerous path. But as Selina watched Maria practice her vows in the mirror, the heirloom veil resting beside her like a promise of a perfect future, the last of her resistance crumbled. The perfect bride's joy would be her weapon, and the ancient darkness of the past would be her instrument. Her smile, as she handed Maria her bouquet, was the coldest thing in the warm Pampanga morning. The journey to her grandmother's isolated nipa hut felt like a descent into another world, a physical manifestation of the dark path Selina had chosen. The cheerful, sun-drenched streets of San Isidro, still buzzing with anticipation for the wedding, gave way to narrow, winding dirt paths that snaked up the forested foothills of Mount Arayat. The air grew thick and heavy, the cacophony of town life replaced by an oppressive silence broken only by the distant cry of a hawk and the unsettling rustle of unseen creatures in the dense undergrowth. The vibrant greens of the lowland rice fields deepened into the shadowy, muted hues of the ancient forest, where gnarled balete trees draped in moss seemed to watch her pass with silent, judging sentience. Each step away from the familiar was a step closer to the forbidden, and the chill that had nothing to do with the shade seeped into Selina's bones. She pulled her thin shawl tighter, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs, part of her screaming to turn back, to abandon this madness and simply endure the pain of watching Maria's happiness. But the image of Gabriel placing the ring on Maria's finger, the memory of his adoring gaze, flashed behind her eyes, and the jealousy surged anew, a hot, corrosive tide that washed away all hesitation. It fortified her resolve, hardening her heart into a weapon aimed at the heart of her best friend's joy. The hut, when she finally reached it, was exactly as she remembered from dreaded childhood visits, a skeletal structure of bamboo and palm thatch, looking as if it had grown from the mountain itself rather than being built by human hands. It leaned slightly against the slope, shrouded by the canopy of enormous trees that blocked out most of the afternoon sun, casting the clearing in a perpetual, gloomy twilight. The air here was different, still and cold, smelling of damp earth, decaying wood, and the faint, cloying scent of herbs left too long to dry. There was no welcoming smoke from a cooking fire, no sound of radio, only a profound and watchful quiet. Aling Rosa was outside, sitting motionless on a low wooden stool, her back to Selina as if she had been waiting for her. She was a small, wiry woman, her frame swallowed by a faded, traditional dress, her long silver hair woven into a single, severe braid that fell down her back like a rope. She did not turn as Selina approached, her crunching footsteps on the dry leaves sounding obscenely loud in the silence. "You bring a storm with you, child," the old woman said, her voice not much more than a dry rustle,
yet it carried clearly in the still air. She finally turned, and her eyes, deep set and startlingly sharp in a face mapped with a lifetime of wrinkles, seemed to see right through Selina's skin, down into the festering envy in her soul. You were never a good liar, Selina. The storm you bring is not from a city office. It is a personal storm. It smells of a woman's jealousy and a heart's betrayal. She stood slowly, her joints cracking, and gestured for Selina to follow her inside the dark hut. The interior was a single room, cluttered with hanging bunches of dried plants, clay jars, and the pervasive smell of old secrets. From a shadowed corner behind a faded curtain, Aling Rosa retrieved a small, heavy box made of dark, almost black nada wood. It was intricately carved with patterns that were not decorative, but narrative. Scenes of anguish, of figures writhing in torment, their mouths open in silent screams. The wood felt cold, unnaturally so, as if it stored a deep and permanent winter within it. You asked for protection, Selina, but your heart asks for vengeance, Alingrosa whispered, her hand resting on the lid. This is not a talisman of guard. This is a prison for a spirit older than our prayers. The Diwata ding hiling and hinain. It does not grant wishes, it consumes them, and then it consumes the one who wished. It answers the call of envy, and its price is not paid in money, but in soul. It will not just do your bidding, it will take your desire and live it, twist it until the very thing you wanted destroyed becomes your own eternal cage. She fixed Selina with a piercing look. Leave this box closed. Go back to your town. Forgive your friend, whoever she is, and find your own light. But the warning, instead of deterring Selina, only fueled the dark fire within her. The description of the spirit's power was exactly what she wanted, a force of absolute ruin. She saw not a danger, but a promise. With a trembling hand that betrayed not fear, but avaricious anticipation, she reached out and took the box. The moment her fingers made contact, she felt a faint rhythmic pulse, like a sickly heartbeat, emanating from within. Aling Rosa drew back as if burned, her face a mask of sorrow and grim resignation. She had done her duty, the choice was made. Without another word, Selina turned and fled the hut, the cold box clutched to her chest, the whispered name of the spirit already echoing in her mind, a new and terrible prayer.
The night before the wedding held a different quality for Selina, a thick, syrupy darkness that seemed to press in on her from all sides, isolating her in a pocket of palpable malice far removed from the joyful anticipation humming through the rest of San Isidro. In her small, unremarkable room, the cheerful sounds of final wedding preparations from neighboring houses were nothing but a distant, mocking buzz. Here the air was still and charged, heavy with the scent of her own bitterness and the cold, ancient presence emanating from the narrow wood box she had placed in the center of her floor. She had drawn the curtains tight, shutting out the sliver of a moon, plunging the room into an absolute blackness that felt like a cocoon for her hatred. With trembling hands that were now steadied by a fanatical resolve, she began her preparations. She cleared a space on the bare floor, sweeping away invisible dust with a frantic energy. From her bag, she produced the items her grandmother's grim stories had mentioned: a single black candle, its wax the color of a starless midnight, and a small, sharp balisong knife she had stolen from her brother years ago. The knife felt cold and foreign in her hand, a tool of violence that was now to be an instrument of ritual. The moment of truth arrived. She knelt on the cold floor, her heart hammering a frantic, desperate rhythm against her ribs. With a click of the knife, she lit the match. The sudden flare of mundane light, a shocking intrusion in the sacred darkness she was cultivating. She touched the flame to the black candle's wick. It did not catch fire with the cheerful, dancing yellow light. Instead, it sputtered to life with a low, guttering flame that burned an unnatural, sickly green, casting long, distorted shadows that writhed up the walls like tormented souls. The light it gave was meager and hateful, illuminating only the immediate vicinity of the box, making everything else in the room recede into a deeper, more menacing gloom. The green glow reflected in her eyes, making them look hollow and possessed. Taking a deep, shuddering breath that tasted of ozone and wax, she reached forward and unclasped the cold iron latch of the box. The lid swung open without a sound, and there it lay, nestled in its bed of black velvet, the mutia. In the ghastly green candlelight, it was more beautiful and more terrifying than she remembered. The pearl was a perfect oily teardrop, and deep within its core, swirls of midnight blue and bruised purple seemed to move with a sluggish, sentient life. It didn't reflect the light. It consumed it, drawing the sickly green glow into its depths and holding it captive. This was it, the point of no return. She leaned forward, her face so close to the talisman she could feel a psychic coldness radiating from it, a chill that had nothing to do with temperature. She closed her eyes, but not to pray for strength. She closed them to better visualize her target, to pour every ounce of her concentrated venom into the words she was about to speak. When her voice finally came, it was a low, guttural rasp, barely audible, yet each syllable seemed to vibrate in the frozen air, given weight and substance by the ancient evil in the box. I call to you, spirit of wish and lament. Hear the voice of my envy. See the face of she who has everything I was promised. In her mind, she conjured Maria's smiling, blissful face, and the image was like a brand on her soul. I wish her joy to turn to ashes. I wish her perfect day to become her eternal nightmare. Let every smile be a mask for terror, every vow a whispered curse. Let the laughter of her guests sound like the shrieks of the damned in her ears. Her voice grew stronger, laced with a vicious fervor. I offer you her happiness. I offer you her peace. Cling to her, fester in the very thing that marks her as a bride, in the symbol of her purity and her future. Let your sorrow poison her veil. Let your lamentations become the music of her wedding march. As she spoke the final damning word, a profound silence fell. So absolute it felt like a physical pressure on her eardrums. The green candle flame did not flicker. It was extinguished, snuffed out as if by an invisible hand that despised its very existence. The darkness that followed was total and suffocating. And then a wind. It came from nowhere, a freezing gale that tore through her sealed room, whipping her hair around her face, scattering papers, and carrying with it the smell of turned earth and forgotten graves. In the heart of that impossible wind, she felt it, a presence, vast, hungry, and immeasurably old. It focused on her not with gratitude, but with the predatory interest of a scavenger that had found a suitable host for its pestilence. It had heard. It had accepted. The mutia on the floor glowed with a faint, internal, sickly light for a single second before going dark once more. The ritual was complete. The spirit had been summoned, its target named, its price implicitly agreed upon. Selena knelt in the perfect blackness, gasping, her body shaking with the terror that was now inextricably mixed with a triumphant, ecstatic glee. The deed was done. Maria's fate was sealed.
The morning of the wedding dawned bright and clear, a brilliant, cloudless blue sky that seemed to bless the union of Maria Santos and Gabriel Lorenzo. In the Santos household, the air was a frenetic blend of excitement, laughter, and the sweet, cloying scent of countless flowers that had arrived in a seemingly endless procession. Maria, surrounded by a chattering whirlwind of aunts, cousins, and the other bridesmaids, felt like she was moving through a beautiful, happy dream. The previous night's strange sense of unease, a fleeting shadow she couldn't explain, had been burned away by the sheer, radiant joy of the day. She was the calm in the center of the storm, her heart a steady, joyful drumbeat beneath the layers of satin and lace of her exquisite gown. The final touch, the sacred culmination of the morning's ritual, was the veil. Her grandmother, Lola Isadora, carried the heirloom into the room with a reverence usually reserved for religious relics. The delicate Spanish lace, yellowed with age but no less magnificent, was a web of intricate patterns, each stitch a story, each pearl sewn into its border a silent prayer from a bride of generations past. The room fell into a respectful hush as Lola Isadora, her eyes glistening with tears of memory and pride, prepared to place it upon Maria's head. "This veil has blessed every woman in our family, Apo," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "It has seen joy, it has known sorrow, and it has always carried the strength of our bloodline. Now it will protect you and guide you into your new life." The moment the lace settled over Maria's elaborately styled hair, the dream fractured. It was not a dramatic, violent rupture, but a subtle, insidious shift, like a single drop of black ink falling into a crystal-clear glass of water. A shiver so profound and cold it felt like a sliver of ice had been thrust directly into her spine, shot through her entire body. The cheerful chatter of the room seemed to dull and warp, as if she were suddenly hearing it from the bottom of a deep, cold well. She gasped slightly, her hands flying up to steady the headpiece, and her eyes met her reflection in the large standing mirror. For a single horrifying heartbeat, the face staring back was not her own. The features were hers, but the expression was a grotesque mask of profound, ancient sorrow, the eyes hollow pits of darkness, and the mouth was twisted into a silent, agonized scream. Maria blinked, her heart lurching into a frantic, panicked rhythm, and the image was gone. It was just her, pale and wide-eyed, looking back. "Maria, are you all right, Anak?" her mother asked, concern etching her features. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Maria forced a laugh, a thin, shaky sound. Just pre-wedding jitters," she stammered, dismissing the concerned looks from her family. "It's nothing. The veil is just heavier than I expected." It was a lie. The weight she felt wasn't physical. It was a psychic pressure, a cold, dense presence now settled upon her crown, a crown of thorns disguised as lace. She tried to shrug it off, to attribute the strange sensation to emotion and lack of sleep, but the cold lingered, a permanent winter she alone could feel. The journey to the church was a blur of smiling faces and waved hands, but Maria felt detached, separated from the celebration by an invisible, chilly pane of glass. During the ceremony, as she walked down the aisle on her father's arm, the veil felt increasingly constricting, the lace seeming to itch and prickle against her skin with a life of its own. The beautiful, familiar faces of friends and family lining the pews seemed to flicker at the edges of her vision, their smiles occasionally distorting into grimaces of mockery or masks of decay before snapping back to normal. She clutched her father's arm tighter, her smile becoming a fixed, rigid thing. When she reached the altar and stood beside Gabriel, his own face a beacon of love and unwavering certainty, he felt a momentary surge of warmth. But as he turned to her, his expression shifted minutely. His eyes, so full of adoration, flickered with a sudden, confused alarm. He had seen it too. Just for a fraction of a second, as the priest began to speak, the fine lace over Maria's face had seemed to shift, the patterns rearranging themselves into the visage of a weeping, angry woman before dissolving back into mere embroidery. He blinked, shook his head almost imperceptibly, and chugged it up to a trick of the light filtering through the stained glass windows, a manifestation of his own overwhelming emotions. He reached for her hand, and her grip was icy cold, her fingers trembling slightly. He gave them a reassuring squeeze, projecting a confidence he no longer entirely felt, dismissing the bizarre moment as a shared case of nerves. But the seed of dread, tiny and black, had been planted in his mind. The entity within the veil, the Diwata Dinghiling and Hinaing, was awake. It had found its vessel, and it was beginning its slow, cruel work, twisting the most sacred day of Maria's life into a waking nightmare, one subtle, horrifying flicker at a time.
The transition from the sacred, albeit unnerving atmosphere of the church to the vibrant, music-filled reception hall at the Lorenzo family estate should have been a release, a shift from solemnity to celebration. For Maria, however, it felt like being transported from a chilling premonition into the heart of the nightmare itself. The grand hall was a spectacle of opulence, festooned with dazzling lights and extravagant floral arrangements, the air thick with the irresistible aroma of a lavish feast. A live band played a cheerful tune, and the collective mood was one of unbridled joy and relief after the formalities of the ceremony. For the first few minutes, Maria clung to the hope that the strange sensations in the church had been a fluke, a product of overwrought nerves. She held on to Gabriel's arm like a lifeline, his solid presence a temporary ward against the creeping dread. But the entity, patient and cruel, was merely waiting for the audience to assemble, for the stage to be fully set before it began its true performance. The first sign was the temperature. As they moved to the center of the dance floor for their first dance as husband and wife, a pocket of Arctic air descended upon them, a localized winter that made Maria's breath mist before her lips and raised goosebumps on her arms. Gabriel held her closer, rubbing her arms, attributing her shivering to the air conditioning. But then the lights directly above them flickered. Not a simple power dip, but a violent, strobing pulsation that cast them movements in a series of jarring, stop-motion images. The band's music faltered for a second, the notes distorting into a dissonant, metallic screech that grated against the ears before snapping back to the sweet melody. Then, the whispers began. They started as a faint, sibilant hiss at the very edge of Maria's hearing, like static from an untuned radio. She tried to ignore it, to focus on Gabriel's loving gaze, but the sound intensified, cohering into distinct, venomous voices that seemed to originate from just behind the lace of her veil, spoken directly into her mind. "He doesn't love you," one voice cracked and ancient hissed. "He pities you. A simple town girl playing dress-up." Another, younger and dripping with spite, chimed in. "Look at them all laughing. They're laughing at you, my dear. They know you don't belong here. They know he'll tire of you." The whispers lied about Gabriel, graphic, horrifying fabrications of his infidelity, of secret meetings and contemptuous jokes he shared with his friends about his provincial bride. The whispers twisted every happy memory she had, tainting them with doubt and ugliness. She flinched, her smile becoming a rictus of pain, her eyes darting around the room in a growing panic. To the guests, she appeared increasingly distraught and unstable. She would stumble during the dance, her steps out of sync, her responses to well-wishes becoming delayed and disjointed as she fought to listen to them over the cacophony in her head. She began to see things, phantom figures flickering at the edges of the crowded room, a mourner in black weeping silently in a corner, a pale, decaying version of herself staring back from a reflection in a polished champagne flute, a shadow that fell over Gabriel's face, transforming his loving expression into a leer of contempt for a split second before vanishing. Gabriel was frantic with worry, his earlier unease hardening into a cold knot of fear in his stomach. This was not his Maria. Her hand was ice in his, and her eyes held a terrified, trapped animal look he had never seen before. He tried to lead her to the table, to get her to sit, to drink some water, but she seemed to be receding from him, falling deeper into a private hell he could not access. Selena watched the unfolding catastrophe from a shadowed corner near the champagne tower, her initial surge of triumphant satisfaction now curdling into something else. This was what she had wanted, wasn't it? For Maria's joy to turn to ashes. But she had imagined a social humiliation,
A ruined dress, a fainting spell, something tangible and finite. She had not bargained for this unraveling of a mind. The sheer supernatural brutality of it was terrifying. The entity she had summoned was not a subtle tool. It was a force of pure psychic annihilation, and its hunger seemed boundless. The climax came during the cake cutting. As Maria's trembling hand closed around the silver cake knife, a force, vast and utterly malicious, seized control of her arm. Her eyes widened in sheer terror as she felt her own muscles betray her, her arm jerking with a violent, unnatural strength. With a guttural cry that was part her own and part something else, she swung the knife not at the cake, but in a wide, wild arc, sending the magnificent, multi-tiered creation crashing to the floor in a grotesque splatter of frosting and cake. The music died. The laughter choked off. 100 conversations ended mid-sentence. In the profound, shocking silence that engulfed the hall, all that could be heard was Maria's ragged, terrified breathing. And then a different sound emerged from her. A voice that was a layered chorus of anguish and hatred, a sound that could never belong to a human, rasped through her lips, and it spoke a single, damning name that echoed in the dead air. Selena.
The silence that followed the crash of the wedding cake was absolute and crushing, a vacuum of sound that seemed to suck the very air from the grand hall. It was a silence so complete it had its own weight, pressing down on the assembled guests, freezing them in a tableau of shock and disbelief. All eyes were fixed on the ruin at the center of the room, the beautiful cake now a grotesque mound of splintered tears and smeared frosting, and on the figure of the bride standing amidst the wreckage, her chest heaving with ragged, panicked breaths. The elegant fantasy of the wedding had been violently shattered, and in its place stood a raw, terrifying reality no one could comprehend. Maria's hand still clutched the silver cake knife, her knuckles white, her arm trembling from the aftershock of the violent, involuntary action. But the horror was only beginning. That profound silence was broken not by a scream or a gasp, but by a voice. It did not come from around the room, it emanated from Maria, but it was a sound that could never have come from her gentle soul. It was a low, rasping croak, a dissonant chorus of whispers layered over one another, as if a multitude of tormented souls were speaking through a single ravaged throat. The voice was ancient, dripping with malice and a bitter, gleeful triumph. It filled the hall, slithering into the ears of every horrified guest. "The wish is called to account," the voice hissed from Maria's lips, her own face a mask of terror, a prisoner behind her own eyes. The envious heart seeks its due. The entity, the Diwata ng Hiling at Hinaing, was no longer content with subtle torments. It had been summoned for a purpose, and now, before the entire community of the woman it was destroying, it would name its summoner and exact the final, physical price of the dark bargain. The voice, using Maria's mouth, began to narrate the story of its own awakening. It spoke of a journey into the dark, mist-shrouded mountains, of a narrow wood box cold with ancient evil, of a black candle burning with a sickly green flame. It described the ritual of envy performed in a lonely room, the whispered words of hatred that had slithered through the night to find it. It recounted the specific, venomous desire for a perfect day to be turned into an eternal nightmare. And with each damning sentence, the collective gaze of the room, wide with terror and fascination, slowly turned away from the possessed bride and towards the chief bridesmaid, Selena, who stood pale and rigid by the champagne tower. She named her, not just as the culprit, but as the source, the wellspring of the darkness that had infected the celebration. "She offered your joy to me," the voice rasped, a sound like dry leaves scraping over stone. "She fed me the poison in her heart, and I have feasted well." But the spirit's exposition was merely the prelude to its finale. Having exposed the sinner, it now moved to claim the physical payment for the service it had rendered. As the last echoing syllable of Selena's name faded, Maria's body went stiff. The knife clattered from her suddenly limp hand onto the ruined floor. Her own hands flew to her throat,
not of her own volition, but pulled by an invisible marionette string. Her eyes, the only part of her that still seemed truly hers, bulged in utter, helpless terror, reflecting the horrified faces of her family and new husband. The heirloom veil, the beautiful lace that had been the focus of the curse, began to move. It was no longer a piece of fabric. It was a living, constricting entity. The delicate threads seemed to weave themselves tighter, cinching around her neck with a brutal, mechanical force. The pearls sewn into the border pressed into her skin like cruel, unyielding teeth. A collective gasp finally broke from the crowd when they saw the lace digging deep into her flesh, saw the terrifying, unmistakable act of strangulation happening before them. Gabriel stood for a heart-stopping second, his mind short-circuiting, unable to process the supernatural atrocity unfolding before his eyes. This was his wife, the love of his life, being murdered in front of everyone by the symbol of their union. The sound she made, guttural, choking, desperate gasps of air, shattered his paralysis. Love and primal fear overrode all logic, all terror of the unnatural force he was facing. With a raw, wordless cry that was both a prayer and a battle roar, he launched himself forward. His world narrowed to the veil, to the hideous tension in the lace, to the fading light in Maria's eyes. His hands closed on the fabric in a jolt of psychic ice, so intense it felt like holding lightning, shot through his arms. A wave of pure, undiluted hatred and despair, the essence of the spirit, slammed into his mind, a final warning to let it go, to let it claim its prize. But he held on. His love for Maria was a white-hot shield against the ancient cold, and with a final Herculean pull that tore not just at the lace, but at the very fabric of the curse, he ripped the veil from her head.